Welcome to Rejected Religion Spotlight. I'm Stephanie Shea. My guest this month is Dr. Lucinda Martin. Welcome, Lucinda.
Thanks for having me.
I'm very happy that you are here, that this was able to work out, that I can talk with you today. We are going to be unpacking the very interesting cosmology of Jacob, or Jacob, as would be said in American English, Böhme, a very influential person in the field of both religion and esotericism and art and so many areas, of course. Before I ask you anything else, I have always learned the pronunciation of Jacob. I've never said Jacob. I didn't know how you like to refer to him, so that we're both on the same page.
Yeah, Jacob.
Okay,
Jacob is
good. Okay, and that's not pretentious on my part, but that's just how I've learned his name since I've lived here in the Netherlands. Nobody says Jacob here. They all say Jacob. So, okay. So for the listeners and the viewers, it's so that we're all on the same page. We're talking about someone who in, English spoken language would be Jacob, but we're just going to call him Jacob.
Well, I think there's more difficulty surrounding his last name because of the umlaut on the O.
Right.
So you hear Böhme and Böhme.
Yeah.
Actually, when he was translated in the 17th century into English, they called him Behman. B-E-H-M-E-N, Behman. And so you often see references to Behmanists, and they mean Burmists.
Okay. Something I knew. I learn something new every day. So this is good to know. So for the viewers and the listeners, everybody, we know what we're talking about now. We've got the groundwork laid. Great. All right. I'd like to start out by asking you if you could talk a little bit about yourself, your inspiration to do this really in-depth research into Jacob Böhme. Let's start there.
Well, the kind of the big question driving all of my research is how religion motivates people to change their world, to cope with their world. So very, very much a cultural studies approach.
Okay.
And I wrote a dissertation, and then I had a postdoc on the subject of pietist women writers. So these were 17th century women reformers in Germany. And I kept stumbling across Jacob Böhme. And this postdoc was actually at the University of Halle in Germany, which is a center for pietist studies. And two of my colleagues there also kept stumbling across Böhme. One was working on a dissertation about an alchemist, Johann Conrad Dippel, who was inspired by Böhme. And another one was working on a dissertation about the philosopher Friedrich Schelling, who has written a lot about freedom, human freedom. Okay. And he took a lot from Böhme. So very different subjects, but all interested in Böhme. And I like to tell people that Jacob Böhme is the most important thinker you've never heard of, because he's really behind a lot of important ideas that other people have developed. So Hegel's dialectics and Kandinsky's ideas about modern art and, Philip K. Dick, even science fiction, so all over the place. So myself and my two colleagues started talking, who is this Jacob Böhme and how can we get a handle on him? Because he's, super difficult to read and understand. And so we first formed a Jacob Böhme reading group, and we eventually decided to put together a little conference to present our work, and we wanted to invite a few other speakers to come. And we actually ran into a lot of resistance because some people at that time at the university said, "This is a fanatic. Oh. You can't work on this. You can't do this." But we sort of pushed through, and we showed how important he is for so many different people, and we were allowed to do it. And that was 2008. It's been a while.
Wow.
2009, there was an explosion of interest in Böhme. So there was a major conference on Böhme in Munich, put on by Germanists, where I gave a paper. And there was a conference that same year in Oxford, done by Ariel Hussein, who studies the influence of Böhme in England. And suddenly, I think Germans really noticed. Here's this writer that everybody else seems to think is important. He's very big in English scholarship and French scholarship, and was really neglected in Germany for the simple reason that he was a lay theologian. And study of theology and religion in general in Germany for a long time was really dominated either by Catholics or Lutherans, because those were the two confessions that you could be.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what happened, all this interest in Burma, people come internationally every year to Burma's hometown of Görlitz, and they look for the museum, and there's not one. So the state of Saxony, where Görlitz is located, got interested in making a Jacob Böhme museum. Well, how do you start with such a thing? How do you take a really difficult writer? Some people say the most difficult German writer, which is saying a lot.
Yeah.
and how do you make some kind of exhibition about him that would be interesting for the public? So they looked around and they found me. I not only had the background in the context and Jacob Böhme, but I also had a background in art, because I studied art and worked as an artist and worked in museums before I made the switch to academia. We got a major grant for this exhibition. 2017, we did an exhibition in Dresden, and over 30,000 people came. We then applied for more money. I was working together with Claudia Brink at the State Art Collections in Dresden, and Cecilia Muratori, who's a historian of philosophy. And we were the curators of this exhibition, and then of a series of international exhibitions. We had an exhibition in Coventry, one in Amsterdam, and one in Wrocław in Poland. So those were all three places where Burma had a major influence. And of course, all of those exhibitions were accompanied by conferences and lectures and catalogs and books. So there's a lot of interest in Burma, and a lot of attention, a lot of things were in newspapers. And so I think that we have managed to bring Burma at least to a wider public.
Yes, I would totally agree with that. I think you're doing very important work in this area and bringing, this much needed attention to him and his work. I became personally just introduced to him and learning a little bit about his work when I was studying at the University of Amsterdam during the part where we were studying Western esotericism, and this was made very, very known to us from the get-go that this man is super important, but he is very complex and very difficult to talk about. And it's very difficult for, I think, even though the professors that we had did an excellent job, there's so much to unpack with Böhme when you come to his writings and his, the things that he's thinking about. Sometimes it is hard to, in just a classroom setting, for a limited time, just to get into. Because once you start scratching the surface, then there's like, oh my gosh, there's just so much here, so much material, and you only have a limited amount of time to talk about it. So what is it that you focus on? So anyway, I always knew that Böhme was something that I wanted to talk about on my platform, but I never felt that there was like the right time to do so. So when I met you and I found out that what you were doing, I was like, oh, this is the perfect person that I can ask to come on to talk about Böhme. So perhaps it would be a good idea to also unpack his biography. What happened to him that put all of this into motion? There was this very extraordinary experience that he had. If you could talk about that.
So Böhme was born 1575 in a village near Görlitz. You can imagine near the Polish-German border today. His father was a fairly well-to-do farmer. Böhme probably went to the local school for a basic education. And then a few years later, he moved to Görlitz to become a shoemaker. He didn't stick with that trade for long. He became a trader after a while. Um, but what you have to keep in mind is that Görlitz today and Görlitz then were two different, very different cities.
Okay.
It was on the Via Regia, which was a major trade route, and it was a vibrant intellectual center. So the mayor of the town, Bartholomeus Scultetus, was known far and wide for reforming calendars, and he was in touch with famous astronomers like Kepler and Brahe, and lots of famous Kabbalists, famous alchemists, people like this passed through the city. And Böhme was very tied in to these intellectual circles who would meet and read and discuss books. Unfortunately, he doesn't often name the books and the authors he read. He specifically mentions Paracelsus, and he mentions a book called Wasserstein der Weisen, which is also an alchemical book. So we have to kind of guess from his terminology that he uses and so forth, where his ideas are coming from. Now, around 1600, it's reported that Böhme had a kind of mystical experience. And he says it arose when he looked at the light reflecting from a metal vessel, probably a pewter bowl, something like that. And he says, in a quarter of an hour, I understood more than as if I had been at schools of higher learning for years. And the key insight was that darkness is necessary to make light visible, and that darkness and light are in all things. Yeah, so this tension, and he says it's darkness and light, it's death and life, it's hot and cold. He sees these oppositions everywhere, and he says without them there would be no dynamism to life. We need these oppositions to give life its energy. He kind of sees that as the motor of the universe. And he says that he was pregnant for 12 years with this vision, with all that he had seen and understood, but he didn't really know how to put it in words, not having a university education. So he struggled, and at the end of 12 years, he had his Aurora, which remained unfinished. It's a fragment, but as a fragment, this handwritten manuscript was passed around among his friends. And that's how it became known in the public, and that's how it became known to the local pastor, Gregor Richter, who was absolutely incensed that a simple shoemaker would dare to write about theological subjects. So he complained to the city council, who interrogated Böhme, and he was not happy that the city council didn't really punish Böhme. They just said, look, you need to stop writing. And they confiscated the manuscript, which is actually very fortunate, because the manuscript that they confiscated is the one that's held today in Wolfenbüttel. So we have that original manuscript because of the city council. And it does seem that Böhme followed those instructions and didn't write for the next years. At least if he did it in secret. But around 1618, we're just on the eve of the 30 Years' War. He decides, with the clouds of war are gathering and all these terrible things are happening, the world needed his message. And so he writes his 3 principles. And then in just the few years after that, about 4 years' time, he writes 20 more works. So he's just writing full time. 1624, he goes to Dresden. He wants to present his work at court to the prince, and he probably didn't get to talk to the prince, but we know that he talked to other people in the cabinet, and he was hosted by the court alchemist, and his work was very well received. Now, this sort of flight to Dresden was also occasioned by the publication of his one book that was published during his lifetime, His Way to Christ. And again, this Richter, is really angry and complaining. And so Böhme leaves town for a bit. Böhme is able to defend himself because he says that it's actually a nobleman who had it printed and that Böhme had no knowledge of it.
Okay.
I'm a bit of that. But it's at any rate the one book that he saw in print in his lifetime. And I think it's interesting to note, though, that he had these very dedicated followers, and even far afield. He was corresponding with people as far away as Vilnius. Um, and, he would send bits of manuscripts, and people would send him, also books. They would send him food. They would send him questions. There were, lots of interesting things going on in his letters. Um, and after his death, his friends continued copying and distributing copies, handwritten copies of his works, because of course they were forbidden and could not be published.
Okay.
And these underground networks managed to get his documents to the Netherlands soon after his death, already in the 1630s. A follower named Abraham von Frankenberg, who's also a very important Christian theosophist, was very instrumental in this. And actually, I'm very fortunate that the heirs of the Frankenberg family have given me books that belong to Frankenberg and to his heirs. So at any rate, these documents came to Amsterdam, and were published then as translations in Dutch. These then reached England, and already in the 1640s, Böhme was translated in English. So we have a situation that most of his writings were published in Dutch and English before German. But then throughout the 17th century, we have certain works appearing in German, 1640, Mysterium Magnum, the letters, and it's finally in 1682 that a Böhmist called Johann Georg Gichtel is able to gather a group of men who, they transcribe all of Böhme's theosophical writings, and we have the first complete edition.
And when did that happen? What year?
1682.
Oh, so that wasn't that far past his death then.
Well, it's a period between 1624 and 1682 when you mostly have these underground manuscripts. Right. And remember, even when they were published in 1682 in the Netherlands, they're still forbidden in Germany.
Right.
So, they had to be smuggled underground, sold on the black market, and so forth and so on. And of course, you had many different principalities, so there would be different rules in different places. So you might buy a book and it was okay to buy it, and then you travel to a nearby state and you get arrested for having that book.
Okay, I see. Just as an aside, you mentioned theosophists and Christian theosophists. What Böhme, I guess his ideas, his work, his oeuvre, I guess you could say, this is known as Christian theosophy. And right. Maybe you could kind of, for people who might not be, well versed in all of this, what set that apart from the main beliefs of that time with Lutheranism and Catholicism on the other side of the coin?
So what characterizes Christian theosophy is the goal of integrating religion with natural philosophy, the study of nature, the study of the stars. And in fact, the very first sentence of Böhme's Aurora, he says that he wants to study the three roots of a tree. And he says these three roots are theologia, astrologia, philosophia. Yeah, those three. And philosophia for him means the study of nature. So we talked about alchemy, the study of nature. It went by the name philosophy. Yeah, and of course, astrologia. In this period, there's no strict division between studying the stars and predicting the future based on studying the stars. So even people like Kepler or Brahe, who were very accomplished mathematicians, they also did this thinking that if one could simply understand the stars well enough, one could predict the future and advise kings about when to start wars or when to spend money and so forth.
Right, yeah, that was the mindset was very different at that time than how people nowadays look at astrology in that regard. This was a very influential, ideas that had a lot of reach and influence for modern day sensibilities. It would be we kind of look at that as like a silly thing. That's something you look at in the newspaper, you read your daily horoscope, and it's just kind of meant as entertainment. But this was serious business for these people in that time. So there's putting it into a context. If it would be helpful as well, if you could talk about, you mentioned Böhme's principles of reality. If you could kind of unpack that a little bit, what his main, main ideas? What was he talking about in so many words?
Well, he talks about a lot of things.
I know.
I think one of the most important concepts is the so-called ungrund, or unground.
Yeah.
And this may or may not be a direct translation of the Hebrew in sof, which also means unground.
Okay.
And the unground, the ungrund, Böhme imagines an original primeval darkness out of which everything else in creation emerged. And, he backs it all up with biblical quotes. So in the book of Genesis, it says, starts off, darkness was on the face of the deep. Yeah. And then there was this movement. Yeah. And this movement, Böhme says, that's the great mystery. Well, how this movement happened. But this movement, which he also calls a seeing, is when the divinity became aware of itself within this darkness. And at this moment, you not only have the divinity, but you have the divinity reflecting on itself. So you go from one thing to two things. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And the second thing is the light principle. He talks about the first principle, the second principle. He also likens it to Christ. He talks about the sun, or the zone. Yeah. And he likens it to the actual sun, because Böhme adopts heliocentrism. So, people like to say Böhme was so irrational. Actually, Böhme adopted many of the most progressive scientific ideas in his time. And that's one of the things that made him objectionable for people. All of the major theologians, Luther, Calvin, the Catholic hierarchy, they said, no, the earth is in the center of our cosmos, not the sun. Yeah. So at any rate, Böhme says, you have these two principles, and this process of creation out of this ungrund is constant and ongoing, because the divinity wanted to know more and more about itself. And each moment of seeing is a moment of creation. You can think a plant, an animal, an angel. And this seeing takes place through the mirror of Sophia, or godly wisdom. Okay? So in many books in the Bible, wisdom actually speaks in the first person. Wisdom, Sophia in Greek. Wisdom, Sophia, was with the Father from the beginning. And early Christians understood this to be a female element within the Godhead. And Böhme understands it that way too. And in fact, he needs a female element within the Godhead, because Böhme says that God encompasses all of the possibilities of the cosmos. So it would not even be possible for Böhme to imagine an all-male God.
Right.
Yeah. I'll just show you one little image here, since we talk about the eyes, because these eyes come up over and over again in the illustrations of Böhme's works. And it's both the idea of the seeing in creation, the divine seeing, but it's also the idea of the inner eye of imagination. And I can talk a bit more about that in a few minutes, but imagination is really central in Böhme's system, because God imagined everything into being. And we have to also imagine our rebirth, and we have to imagine how we can change our world. Yeah. Now, one of the most controversial ideas in Böhme's system is his idea of darkness, because he says darkness is necessary Death is necessary. Sin is necessary because human beings have to have free will. And people criticized him for this because they said, does that mean that God wanted, sin and death and misery? Yeah. And Böhme explains that this original Ungrund, he also calls it freedom, by the way.
Oh.
Because he says nothing was fixed, neither physically nor morally. Nothing was fixed. And human beings have this darkness within them, this darkness that allows us to have freedom and to choose. So that's the kind of good darkness. And part of the confusion is that Böhme uses darkness in different ways. So on the one hand, it's the source of the divinity. It's also the source of our freedom and our ability to have a conscience. But he also then does use it in the more traditional way to simply mean, evil and war and, all of these things are also dark. Yeah? So there's a bit of confusion surrounding that. Now, the whole world is constantly being created, being born. God is being revealed. Those are synonyms for Böhme. Birth, creation, revelation. And he even sees his own writing process as part of that. Yeah? So it's part of this cosmic thing that's happening. And we are called as human beings to be reborn, to try to get back to the original image that God intended for us. And this is where Böhme, I think, really gets tricky for some people. So in the book of Genesis, there are two different tellings of creation.
Yeah.
In the first one, God says, let us, not me, let us create them in our image, male and female. And then later, we have the creation of Eve from Adam's rib. Böhme understands that as two different stages or two different creations of humanity. And the first one was purely spiritual. So this first spiritual person, the Urmensch, he calls him, the original human, had an angelic light body and was continuous with nature and continuous with God. Yeah. And that's the image we want to get back to. And it's only because of the fall that we have these physical bodies, that nature was in that way necessary. Yeah. So Böhme says that in our imaginations, we should pray and we should contemplate and we should meditate and we should try to come closer to that original harmony, which includes having a male-female body. Now, what does that mean? He talks about male and female tinctures, so using the language of alchemy. And I don't think he's talking about any kind of sex organs. I think he's just talking about essences in some sense. But at any rate, this idea really sparked imagination and led to lots of different experiments in religious history.
Right. Right. So the fall then for Böhme wasn't necessarily sin, if I'm understanding correctly.
Well, the fall was sin, but it wasn't the famous bite of the apple through Eve. There's a passage in Genesis where Adam falls asleep. And for Böhme, sleep was the first sin because Adam took his attention away from God. And we are supposed to have our attention on God all the time.
Okay, so Adam then, and Adam as the Urmensch, given that name, Adam, but not as most people would understand Adam as, being purely male. There's no female qualities to Adam. But Adam in this sense is this both male and female light entity because that happened, that Adam decided to sleep. That's when everything went wrong. And it wasn't a woman's fault. It had nothing to do with fruit. It had nothing to do with any of the stuff that most people attribute that too. In Böhme's, of course, in his cosmology, he's he has a very different idea about that. So, right. So then the second creation then was the material creation. Then I take it, right?
That's
okay.
right. Yeah.
Okay.
And Böhme is not completely negative about nature, as some might think. Some of his followers were. Gichtel is very negative about nature, but Böhme says you will never learn more about God than when you walk in a blooming meadow. So he's all about studying nature and combining it with religion, and that's really, of course, the essence of Christian theosophy.
I see. So this would then, because I've, of course, in my own studies and own reading about Böhme, that he drew on other traditions such as Christian Kabbalah, which also has this idea of, well, in that case, it was like journeying back to the Godhead. So, there was already, the fall had already happened, but we were trying to get back through these paths back to the source of God. So that probably influenced his thought. But then also with the Paracelsus, and did he have anything to do, or did he speak about or write about Naturphilosophie, those types of concepts where there was this, the idea that, as you said before, God is in nature, God is nature, nature is God. This would make perfect sense in what you just said about walking through the field, and you have, that's your perfect learning space to know about God. So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that, unpack that a little bit more as to what was that about.
So Böhme says clearly that he's not himself an alchemist, but he's very interested in learning about alchemy because he believes that the same principles that operate in alchemy operate as well in spiritual things. So he uses constantly these metaphors. So, for example, the human soul is like an alchemical oven. And when we have a difficult moral decision to make, it's as if we would burn away the impurities to get to the gold of a good decision, And he definitely knows a lot about what other people are writing and thinking, particularly in a book called Signatura Rerum. And this is, of course, the idea, the Paracelsian idea that each thing in nature has a God-given purpose. And that if we look, we can even recognize what that purpose is. So, for example, Paracelsus thought that, walnuts could be used to treat the brain because they kind of look like the brain.
Yes, yeah.
So Böhme talks about the Signatura Rerum a lot, and you can kind of see his development through his books. That in one particular book he will talk more. He talks about Kabbalah also, which he kind of understands. It seems to me as magic, and he connects it to imagination. And then in others more about alchemy and other things, and even the ideas about the original androgyne. There are Platonic sources for a lot of this, but we just don't know because he doesn't tell us the books he read.
Right. But from what he is writing, what he is talking about, is clear that he is drawing upon all these different sources and blending it together into his idea of what the perfect relationship with God would be. In this case, he's not. And another thing that I wanted to ask you about, was he considered like a heretic in the sense that his message was like leading people away from God? Because it didn't sound like the way he was writing and the things that he was saying that he was suggesting that at all. He wanted people to be very close to God. He wanted to be close to God himself. But the reception of his work seemed to be like, oh, this man is just, he's completely lost the lost the point of the whole message that God wants us to understand. So could you talk to expand on that?
Well, a lot of the debates in the early modern period about different doctrines really have to do with control, because church control was pretty much the same thing as secular control. It was all tied together.
Right.
And so you wouldn't want people to stop going to church or to start forming their own offshoot groups or whatever. And of course, the period saw all these religious wars. During Burma's lifetime, within the German territories, there were three churches that were allowed: the Catholic, the Lutheran, and the Calvinist. But the ruler got to decide which one, which belief, would be in place in a particular region or state. So you couldn't just have people going willy-nilly, writing things that might undermine that in some way. Now, the interesting thing is Böhme didn't think he was undermining anything. He thought he was being a good Lutheran, continuing in the tradition of Martin Luther, who was himself a reformer. He thought the Reformation needed to continue, as many other people did in the period. But Böhme never stopped going to church, never stopped taking communion. And you have to think about when his own pastor, Gregor Richter, was preaching from the pulpit against him, he was sitting there listening to it. So, it's pretty interesting. It was kind of the theater of the period. Of course, during his lifetime, his writings probably didn't circulate that far. It was mostly these learned men, these intellectual groups. But of course, after his death, they became much more popular and spread further, and copies, both handwritten copies, they proliferated. And then, of course, starting in the 1630s with the Dutch translations and the English translations, and then finally some German prints as well. So he became this really popular underground cult author, whether people always understood him or not.
Well, speaking on that point of whether or not people were really understanding what it was that he actually meant to say, or, his thinking, you wrote an article that I found very interesting called Jacob Böhme and the Spiritualist Reformation of Gender. And I think this ties back into what you were talking about at first, because you were looking into women and ideas about women in religion, gender-based type subject matter. So in this article, you discuss how some reformist groups viewed the concept of Sophia, as you mentioned before, wisdom, and how traditional roles of women were changing in these groups. And you, in particular, you discuss a woman called Anna Magdalena Franke,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and her association with a group known as the Angelic Brethren. Now, this, I think, is very fascinating, because this is like an example of how people and groups of people start to interpret things, as you suggest in your article, in maybe different ways than what Böhme was actually intending. But I was hoping that you could expand more on the story of Anna Franke and offer your views on how these groups, or if these groups are deviating from this original message, and maybe that they're trying to insert other themes or behaviors or practices, beliefs into this already this framework, and expanding it in a certain way, I guess you could say. But anyway, take it away.
Well, in the 17th century, you just have this mushrooming of different groups, starting new efforts based on Böhme's writings. You have lots of just little conventicles, which were just like little local groups of people who would read together and pray together and so forth. And many of these groups are being led by women. They're inspired by, of course, the figure of Sophia, but in general, Böhme's idea that the most important thing about a person, a radical idea in the time, was the inner human being and not the outer, okay? Because in this period, even what clothing you could wear was very strictly defined by law, according to your profession and your position in society and so forth. And, women were, it was seen as unchaste for women to speak publicly. So you have, and it was, of course, impossibility for women to be interpreting scripture. But of course, lots of things are happening in this period. One of the things that's happening is that because of humanism, everybody starts wanting to learn to read the biblical languages. And you in particular have a lot of wealthy aristocratic women becoming experts in Hebrew and Greek and coming up with new biblical interpretations. And, they notice that in the Old Testament, God is sometimes signified with a female word and sometimes with a male word. So you start having these kinds of discussions coming up. And people actually saw no conflict between going to their assigned church on Sunday, but also participating in some of these groups. Now, there were some groups that said, the state church is corrupt and they've been involved in war, and they really did try to fight against the churches. But most people didn't. Most people thought, I can take from here and there, and I can read these foreign books that are coming in, and they saw no conflict. Yeah. So the expanded roles for women is one thing you see. You also see just a breaking down of hierarchies in general. So you see aristocratic women sitting in the same groups with rustic craftsmen. Also, absolutely not okay in the period. But then you also have more sort of theologically based new efforts. Now, Böhme himself never preached celibacy. He was married, he had 4 sons, but many of these groups that come up in the 17th century preached celibacy. They thought, first of all, the world would be ending soon, and we don't need to be having more children. But they also associated with the physical body and sexuality with the fall. And they said, let's wait for our marriage with the divine Sophia in heaven. Let's wait for the spiritual body. And they thought they should spend their time in prayer and contemplation and so forth. One of these groups was the Angelic Brethren, established by Johann Georg Gichtel in Amsterdam and later led by a man called Überfeld. And they had a large correspondence network all over Northern Europe. And they were quite a bit different from Böhme in many ways. For example, they really thought that you should just stay home and suffer. Yeah, suffer for your beliefs. They were not interested in studying nature as Böhme had been. And of course, this idea with celibacy. And I think it's not too much to say that you can tell from the writings that many of these individuals who were involved were probably gay. But of course, there was no word for that in the early modern period. Right. It only existed as a crime.
Yeah.
But also there are many other reasons for a person to maybe want to be celibate and not marry in the period. It was hard to marry. It was expensive to marry. You had to get permission from all kinds of levels of government and show that you could support a family. And maybe you just wanted to devote your life to scholarship and study. Yeah. So you have these groups coming up like the Angelic Brethren, but also others. You even have spiritual marriages where a man and a woman would decide, okay, we're going to get married, but there's not going to be any sex or children. We're just going to pray and work for God. Yeah. You also have a few groups that go to the other extreme. A group I studied called the Mother Ava Society, who actually developed sexual rituals to try to rid themselves of the burden of sin. And these rituals were, in particular for women, terrible because they involved crushing the uterus because they thought that was the seat of sin. And the women who underwent that, of course, had terrible health problems for the rest of their lives. But you can imagine in this period the kinds of how mainstream society would see these kinds of things, when suddenly there's a new celibate community popping up in your neighborhood, or even worse, when there are these weird sexual rituals. And of course, none of this is what Böhme had in mind. And some of these groups, of course, ended up immigrating to North America. So the Erfurter cloister in Pennsylvania was one of the largest, but also the Herrenhut community. From all of their offices, all of their architecture, everything was structured by this idea of androgyny, the male and the female. So these things, these were major experiments that, even have in some ways offshoots to the present day.
Were these groups as well? I mean, they looking at their practices and beliefs and how they deviated from what Böhme was actually writing about, talking about. I mean, were they still debating these things within their own groups as to justify what it is that they're doing that's different? Were they trying to validate their beliefs and practices still within their own groups?
Probably less within their own groups as with each other.
Okay.
Yeah, a major competition for patronage and for membership. And you have a couple of major groups coalescing. So the Angelic Brethren is one. Another one that I really have studied a lot are called the Philadelphians. Most people have heard of the Philadelphian Society in England, which was led by Jane Lead, she had these beautiful visions based on Sophia. And their core thing comes from Böhme's statement that Jews, Turks, and that Christians, Jews, Turks, and heathens are all brothers, and that they can all be saved, they can all be righteous. This is also one of the things that really got him rejected by mainstream theologians who said, no, there's one way to salvation, and that's through Christ and through this kind of ritual and so forth. So the Philadelphians actually wanted first to convert all of the different Christians, but then also the Jews and Muslims. So they really were ambitious. But they were all inspired by Böhme and many other groups, by the way, as well. And at a certain stage, the pietists in Halle also were communicating. So you have people writing letters and discussing and saying what they think and trying in some way to come together. And that's where Anna Franke comes in. Anna Franke had been involved already as a young person with some of these very radical groups who believed in celibacy. She ended up marrying Franke, but the two of them studied together and worked out together that it's okay to be married as long you can still have the marriage to Sophia in the afterlife. That was really important. But Anna Franke was a member of the Angelic Brethren and kept corresponding with people in Amsterdam and Leiden. And at a certain point, there's a crisis in the Franke marriage because she decides she wants to live celibately. And she also decides that even though the efforts in Halle are good, they're weak and they're worldly and they're not as spiritual as what's happening in Amsterdam and in other places. And so this is kind of a scandal that even though, Franke and the whole Halle project is still famous today, the Frankische Stiftungen still exist. So it's this whole campus, and in the 17th century, they had an orphanage and printing press and missions and Bible distribution and all this stuff. But they got the patronage of the Prussian and the Danish crowns. And so it's clear that to have that patronage, you can't be too radical. Yeah. So they went back to kind of a more mainstream kind of reforming impulse that basically just involved a little bit more participation for laity, so more Bible circles and more singing in church and some of these things, but not women leaders. Certainly no experiments with celibacy and these kinds of things.
I find this to be very, very interesting in that it's at least clear in my mind that you see all of these little tiny glimpses of things happening that later groups would also be picking up on. And I'm speaking specifically of esoteric groups. like the Theosophical Society, of course, also had women in positions of leadership. And I mean, even the founder was a woman. So, men and women were, active in their own ways in both, but no one had like a monopoly over the authority, position. So, and also with the sex rituals in the one group, I mean, not to say that I'm not trying to equate it to sex magic, but that there were these ideas about sexual activity and how this was transforming the person, that maybe there could be like little seeds of the beginnings of how other people later in these other groups started to think about sex magic and what that was doing to, those rituals, what those were doing in a magical sense. Of course, these people were not thinking of magic, but, how these were like little tiny seeds of thought that started people thinking about, oh yeah, okay, so we're not just a spiritual body, we're also a material body, and how we can use these aspects of ourselves to achieve some sense of transcendence or transformation. So yeah, I think that's probably why, my own way of thinking about it, that that's why Böhme was, even though it deviated from maybe what he was speaking of originally, but all of this thought that came out of what he was talking about started to then influence all of these. As you said, it was all underground stuff, and it wasn't, stuff that we couldn't really be out in the open about. Well, that's esoteric in its sense. It has to be kept secret. So yeah, I think that this is, for many people maybe wouldn't make on the surface, wouldn't make that connection between, Jacob Böhme and esotericism, but that, yeah, he kind of was one of the forerunners, maybe in a proto-esotericist in a way. Maybe I'm being too free in my thought here. Maybe I'm being a little bit too taking too many liberties there. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I just think that the role of the body in religion and spiritual things is a big question throughout religious history. And of course, for these Burmas, it is interesting that either the denial of sexuality or this, over-the-top sexuality, they were both key to salvation. And I think that's interesting. And Burma, even though many of these groups went to North America or other places, Burma insisted that it's all really spiritual. He said Zion is within us. So he didn't want people to form new groups, to establish new rituals, to go to North America. People took a lot of liberties with what he said. Yeah. But I think there's also a very positive inspiration. I would see, for example, with the Philadelphia Society, and their efforts to bring the righteous of the world together. I mean, these are the foundations of modern democratic institutions.
Exactly. Yeah.
This idea that people from different religions and different peoples can work together, and it was a very idealistic effort.
Yeah, indeed, I agree with you. As you are quite well educated in art, we're not going to be able to get into a lot of this at this point, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about it, if you would, how Böhme was influential for later artists. Because you mentioned Kandinsky at the beginning of the interview. I'd like it if you would talk more about this, expand on this.
Well, this is a big subject that needs to be more on. But what I can tell you is that, you have these, really at the birth of modern abstract art, you have these artists all sitting together, the Dadaists in the Café Voltaire in Zurich, and they're reading Jacob Böhme aloud, And, it's been known for some time that Böhme was an influence on Kandinsky. Kandinsky, of course, wrote this book, The Spiritual in Art. Mm-hmm. And, he and others wanted to access another plane of perception or understanding. And of course, one of the things we didn't really talk about is that Böhme talks a lot about different planes of existence. And actually, one of his key ideas is the idea of three worlds. So that there's a world of darkness and a world of light, and then there's the world of nature where they come together. And this idea of different worlds has been very influential in art, but also in science fiction. So Kandinsky is one person, but there are many others. I just came out with Claudia Brink with a new edited volume about Böhme, and I have an article talking about the influence on an artist called Julius Bissier, and he did this kind of abstract work. And whereas Kandinsky had the idea from Böhme of the artist as the creator who just keeps creating and creating and creating, and really the idea that like the divinity itself, you can just keep making new forms, and they don't have to mock nature. This was a new idea in art. Up until then, art had to look like an object that you and I can see. Yeah, so Kandinsky says, no, it doesn't have to. The artist can make something new. Well, Bissier is very interested in Eastern religions and art, but he also studied Meister Eckhart and Böhme. And for him, the whiteness of the canvas is like Böhme's Ungrund. And when the artist paints, it's that same act of creation. And we see these ideas coming up over and over again in artists, and of course developing in other directions as well.
Very fascinating stuff. I would love it if you'd come back again at a later date to talk more about all of this. I think that this would be a great conversation, that you could go into more detail about these three worlds and talk about more of the different artists that you have studied that implement these concepts, these ideas from Böhme. I would really love it. If you're interested, I'd love to have you back at another time. Great. In closing, you just mentioned you have a new publication out. Are there any other publications or projects that you can discuss?
Well, the newest one, or the most important one, is probably this, Jacob Böhme in Three Worlds. It's the most cutting-edge stuff on Böhme for the 3 foreign exhibitions. It was 3 conferences. And we discovered a lot of new stuff that we just didn't know about before, in particular Burma's influence in Scandinavia and in Eastern Europe. And these things are under-researched simply because of the languages. So, English and French and German and Dutch, these are, but, what happened in the Polish language and in Czech and in Russian, and the surface has barely been scratched.
Indeed, we have only scratched the surface today because there's so much more that can be said about this. But I'm glad to have like a little introduction, in any case, of Böhme and his thought. Well, thank you for sharing all of this with me today. I will be sure to provide all the links that I can in the program notes. I highly suggest that people read your work, look at what it is that you're doing to learn more about Böhme, because he is, imagination is such a important concept for Böhme, and it's also something that I find that keeps coming up again and again and again in the things that I am interested in. So every time I'm, learning about something new and this word, the imagination, pops up, I'm like, see, this is the reason why I'm looking into this, because there's this imagination that is so central to all of these people and their ideas and their work. Well, I wish you continued success with your projects, with what you're doing. And thank you again. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
My pleasure. Take care.